Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked the mining equipment one more time. The night shift at the facility on Kepler 442b was always quiet, but tonight felt different. The purple sky above looked darker than usual, and the twin moons cast strange shadows across the crystalline rocks that covered this alien world. He had been working here for 3 years now, ever since the colonial administration had established the mining operation. The pay was good, and someone had to extract the rare minerals that Earth needed for its expanding fleet. Jake didn't mind the isolation. After what happened during the war back home, he preferred the peace and quiet of this distant planet. The facility hummed softly around him as the automated systems continued their work. Jake walked through the corridors, checking readings and making sure everything was running smoothly. His footsteps echoed in the empty halls. Most of the other workers were asleep in their quarters, preparing for the morning shift change. That's when the sky exploded. A brilliant flash of light filled the observation windows, brighter than both moons combined. Jake rushed to the main viewing deck and pressed his face against the reinforced glass. Something massive was streaking across the atmosphere, trailing fire and sparks behind it like a comet. But this was no natural phenomenon, the object was. Clearly artificial, its hull glowing red-hot from atmospheric entry. Pieces broke off as it descended, creating a shower of burning debris that lit up the night sky. Jake grabbed his binoculars and tracked its path as it disappeared behind the jagged mountain range to the east. Whatever it was, it had crashed. Jake's training kicked in immediately. As the facility's only certified search and rescue specialist, he knew protocol demanded investigation of any potential crash site. There might be survivors who needed help. The fact that the craft didn't match any human design in the database made it even more urgent. He quickly changed into his environmental suit and gathered his equipment. The plasma rifle went into its holster on his back, along with emergency medical supplies, food, water, and communication gear. His all-terrain rover was already fueled and ready in the garage. Jake had learned long ago that preparation saved lives. The night air was thin and cold as he drove across the alien landscape. The rover's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the strange blue sand and twisted rock formations that made this world so different from Earth. The gravity here was lighter, making the vehicle bounce slightly as it navigated the rough terrain. Jake followed the debris trail, stopping occasionally to examine pieces of wreckage that had fallen along the way. The metal was unlike anything he had seen before, with a strange iridescent quality that seemed to shift colors in his flashlight beam. Symbols were etched into some of the larger fragments, flowing and organic in design. After 2 hours of driving, he found it. The main section of the craft had carved a deep furrow in the ground before coming to rest against a cluster of tall crystal spires. It was smaller than he had expected, roughly the size of an escape pod rather than a full ship. The hull was cracked open like an egg, revealing a dark interior filled with what looked like some kind of gel or foam. Jake approached carefully, his rifle ready but not aimed. Steam rose from the wreckage and strange sounds came from within. Not mechanical sounds, but something else. Something that made his skin crawl. He circled the pod, looking for any signs of life. The cockpit area was empty, but the crash couch showed clear signs of recent occupation. Whoever or whatever had been inside was gone, but Jake could see a trail leading away from the wreckage. Footprints in the sand, small and delicate, heading toward a canyon entrance about 50 meters away. That's when he heard them. Screams, high-pitched and desperate, echoing from somewhere deep within the canyon. The sound made Jake's blood run. Cold, he had heard screams before during the war, and these carried the same note of absolute terror. Someone was in trouble. Jake grabbed his gear and followed the trail. The canyon walls rose high on either side, blocking out most of the moonlight. His flashlight beam revealed strange formations in the rock and bioluminescent fungi that glowed with an eerie blue-green light. The air grew warmer as he descended deeper into the canyon. The screams grew louder. Jake moved as quickly as he dared, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. The trail was easy to follow now. Whoever had left the pod was injured. based on the irregular spacing of the footprints and the occasional drops of what looked like blood. Though the blood was blue instead of red, the canyon opened into a wider area filled with natural cave entrances. The screams were coming from one of them, a large opening partially hidden by hanging vines. Jake could see a faint glow coming from within, probably more of the luminescent fungi. He paused at the entrance, listening carefully. The screams had stopped, replaced by a different sound, clicking and chittering like insects but much larger. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle as he realized the implications. Whatever was in there, it wasn't friendly. Moving carefully, Jake entered the cave. The walls were covered with the glowing fungi, providing enough light to see without his flashlight. The clicking sounds grew louder as he followed a natural tunnel deeper into the cave system. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. She was hanging in the center of the chamber, trapped in what looked like a massive spider web. Small and delicate, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow in the fungal light. Her large eyes were wide with terror as three enormous creatures circled her like predators sizing up their prey. The creatures were nightmares made real. 8 legs supported bodies the size of large dogs, covered in dark chitin that gleamed weightily in the dim light. Their heads were dominated by clusters of black eyes and mandibles that clicked and snapped as they moved. Thick, bristling hair covered their legs, and Jake could see venom dripping from their fangs. The girl saw Jake and cried out, speaking rapidly in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was musical despite the fear, with tones and inflections unlike any human language. One of the creatures reared up at the sound, its attention turning toward the tunnel entrance where Jake stood hidden. Jake had perhaps seconds before they noticed him. The girl was maybe 20 feet away, suspended in the web about 8 feet off the ground. The creatures were between him and her, and he counted at least 3 of them, possibly more lurking in the shadows. His military training took over. Assess the situation. Plan the approach. Execute with precision. The plasma rifle hummed softly as he brought it to his shoulder. 3 targets, close quarters, civilian in the line of fire. Not ideal, but workable. Jake had faced worse odds during the border wars. One of the creatures started moving toward the girl, its mandibles opening wide. Jake could see rows of needle-sharp teeth inside its mouth. There was no more time to plan. He stepped into the chamber and fired. The plasma rifle discharged with a brilliant blue flash that lit up the entire cave chamber. The energy bolt struck the nearest creature center mass, burning through its thick shell like paper. The monster shrieked and stumbled backward, smoke rising from the hole in its chest. The other 2 creatures spun toward Jake, their multiple eyes reflecting the weapon's glow like black mirrors. Jake didn't hesitate. His second shot caught the middle creature in what he hoped was its head, the plasma burning away half its face in an instant. The third creature charged toward him, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. Jake rolled to the side as razor-sharp claws scraped against the cave wall where he had been standing. The girl in the web was screaming again, but now her voice carried a different tone. Hope mixed with terror as she watched this strange being fight the monsters that had been hunting her. She spoke rapidly in her musical language, pointing toward the shadows where more clicking sounds emerged. Jake cursed under his breath as he realized there were more of them. His motion sensor was picking up at least 4 additional heat signatures moving through the cave system toward their location. The creatures he had shot were wounded but not dead, their thick shells providing more protection than he had expected. The charging creature recovered from its missed attack and turned back toward Jake. Green fluid dripped from its mandibles as it opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Jake could smell something foul in the air, probably venom or some kind of digestive acid. He fired again, this time aiming for the creature's legs. The plasma bolt severed 2 of its limbs, sending the monster tumbling to the cave floor. But even crippled, it continued to move toward him, dragging itself across the stone with its remaining legs. Jake quickly checked his rifle's power display. 15 shots remaining in the current cell, plus 2 spare power packs, against an unknown Number of hostile creatures in their own territory, it might not be enough. He needed to get the girl down and find a way out of this cave system before they were overwhelmed. The girl was watching him intently, her large eyes tracking his every movement. When their gazes met, she pointed to herself and spoke a single word that sounded like Lyra. Jake nodded and pointed to his own chest, saying his name clearly. She repeated it back with a musical accent that made it sound almost like a song. Jake pulled a cutting tool from his belt and approached the web. Cautiously, the remaining creatures were regrouping, and he could hear more of them approaching through the tunnels. The web material was incredibly strong, like steel cables covered in sticky resin. His cutting tool's laser beam sliced through it slowly. Strand by strand, Lyra was speaking to him constantly now, her voice urgent and worried. She kept pointing deeper into the cave system, making gestures that Jake interpreted as meaning there were others. More of her people, probably trapped somewhere in this nightmare, mazed. As the last strand of webbing parted, Lyra dropped into Jake's arms. She was lighter than he expected, probably due to the different gravity on her homeworld. Her skin was warm to the touch despite its blue color, and he could feel her heart beating rapidly against his chest. She was terrified, but trying to be brave. Jake set her down carefully and immediately noticed she was favoring her left leg. Her ankle was swollen and probably sprained from whatever had happened when she crashed. There were also several deep scratches on her arms where the creatures had tested their claws against her skin. The clicking sounds were getting closer. Jake quickly pulled medical supplies from his pack and fashioned a crude splint for Lyra's ankle using a metal rod and medical tape. She winced as he secured it but didn't cry out. Tough kid, Jake thought to himself. Lyra grabbed his arm and pointed toward one of the tunnel entrances, speaking rapidly in her own language. Jake couldn't understand the words, but her meaning was clear. There were others of her kind somewhere in these caves, and they needed help. Jake looked at his equipment and made a quick decision. His rifle had enough power for maybe 20 more shots if he was careful. He had 3 flashbang grenades, a combat knife, and basic medical supplies. Against an unknown number of highly aggressive alien predators, it would have to be enough. The first wave of creatures emerged from the tunnels as Jake helped Lyra to her feet. These were smaller than the ones he had fought earlier, but they moved in a coordinated pack like wolves. Their eyes gleamed in the fungal light as they spread out to surround their prey. Jake pushed Lyra behind him and raised his rifle. The lead creature leaped toward them with surprising agility, its claws extended. Jake's shot took it in midair, the plasma bolt punching through its chest and sending it crashing into the cave wall, but 2 more took its place immediately. Jake fired again and again, each shot carefully aimed to conserve ammunition. The creatures were learning, though, using the cave's rocky formations as cover and attacking from multiple directions at once. Lyra surprised him by grabbing a sharp piece of crystal from the cave floor. When one of the smaller creatures got too close, she drove the makeshift weapon into its soft underbelly with a fierce cry. Blue-green fluid spurted from the wound as the monster collapsed. Jake grinned despite their desperate situation. This girl had spirit. She wasn't going to be helpless cargo on this rescue mission. They fought their way deeper into the cave system, following Lyra's directions. She seemed to know where she was going, probably following some kind of scent trail, or sounds that Jake couldn't detect. The creatures harassed them constantly, attacking in small groups before retreating into the shadows. Jake's ammunition was running low when they finally reached their destination. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber lit by pools of phosphorescent liquid. In the center of the chamber, on a small island of rock surrounded by the glowing pools, Jake saw them, 6 more beings like Lyra, huddled together in fear. They looked exhausted and wounded, their clothes torn and stained with that blue fluid that served as their blood. Among them was what appeared to be a child, even smaller than Lyra, and an elderly figure who seemed to be their leader. But between Jake and the survivors, at least a dozen of the spider creatures moved back and forth like sentries. They had been playing with their prey, Jake realized, keeping them alive for some reason rather than killing them outright. The creatures had turned their attention toward Jake and Lyra now, sensing new threats in their domain. The largest of the monsters, standing nearly as tall as Jake himself, reared up on its hind legs and let out a sound that was part roar and part screech. Jake checked his rifle's power display one more time. 8 shots left in the current cell. He reached for his first spare power pack and looked at Lyra. She was gripping her crystal weapon tightly, her musical voice now raised in what sounded like a battle song. Together, they stepped into the chamber to face the nightmare that waited for them. Jake studied the chamber carefully before making his move. The phosphorescent pools provided good lighting but also created deep shadows where more creatures could be hiding. The survivors on the rock island were about 30 meters away, separated by the glowing water and at least 12 of the spider monsters. The creatures were clearly intelligent. They had positioned themselves in a defensive formation around their captives, with the largest ones near the water's edge and smaller scouts moving along the chamber walls. They weren't just animals hunting for food. They were organized predators. With a plan, Lyra tugged on Jake's sleeve and pointed to different areas of the chamber, speaking softly in her musical language. She was giving him tactical information about the creature's positions and movements. Jake nodded to show he understood, even though he couldn't follow her words. Her gestures were clear enough. The largest creature, the one that had roared at them, was clearly the pack leader. It stood nearly 3 meters tall with armor-like plating covering its back and head. Its mandibles were bigger than the others, and Jake could see scars on its shell from previous battles. This wasn't its first fight against armed opponents. Jake made his decision. Direct assault would get them both killed, but he couldn't leave those people trapped on that island. He needed to use the environment to his advantage and pick off the creatures one by one. He pulled a flashbang grenade from his belt and showed it to Lyra. She looked confused until he mimed throwing it and covering his eyes. Understanding dawned on her face, and she nodded quickly. Jake pulled the pin and hurled the grenade toward the center of the creature formation. The explosion lit up the entire chamber like a miniature sun, followed by a thunderclap that echoed off the stone walls. The creatures shrieked and scattered, temporarily blinded and disoriented. Jake was already moving, his rifle tracking targets as he ran along the chamber wall. His first shot took down a medium-sized creature that was stumbling blindly near the water. His second shot wounded another that was trying to retreat toward the tunnels, but the flashbang's effect didn't last long. The creatures recovered quickly, their multiple eyes adapting to the sudden change in light. The pack leader let out another roar and charged directly toward Jake, its heavy footsteps splashing through the shallow pools. Jake dove behind a rock formation. Just as the creature's claws raked the air where his head had been, he could hear Lyra shouting something from across the chamber, probably a warning about more creatures approaching from behind. The rifle discharged again as Jake rolled to his left, the plasma bolt catching one of the smaller creatures in the leg. The monster stumbled and fell into one of the phosphorescent pools, its thrashing sending waves of glowing liquid across the chamber floor. That gave Jake an idea. The pools weren't just for light. They were connected to each other by narrow channels, carved into the rock. If he could get the creatures into the water, they would be easier targets. Jake fired at the cave ceiling above one of the larger pools. The plasma bolt superheated the rock, causing chunks to break loose and crash into the water below. The splash created a temporary barrier between him and 3 of the advancing creatures. The pack leader was still coming, though, moving around the pools with surprising agility for something so large. Jake could see intelligence in its black eyes and something else, hunger. These creatures weren't just defending territory. They were protecting their food supply. Lyra had made her way to a different position along the chamber wall. She was moving despite her injured ankle, using her crystal weapon to fend off smaller creatures that tried to corner her. Jake was impressed by her courage and fighting instinct. The survivors on the island were calling out to them now, their voices mixing with Lyra's in a harmony that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Jake couldn't understand their words, but he could hear the hope in their voices. They believed he could save them. Jake's rifle power cell died just as the pack leader reached his position. The creature reared up on its hind legs, towering over him like a nightmare made real. Its mandibles opened wide, revealing a throat that glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the pool's. Jake rolled backward and grabbed for his spare power cell, but the creature was too fast. Claws scraped against his environmental suit as he barely avoided being gutted. He could hear the fabric tearing and hoped the suit's self-sealing system would hold. The new power cell clicked into place, just as the creature lunged again. Jake's shot at point-blank range burned a hole through the monster's shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop the attack. Weight crashed down on him as the creature's bulk drove him to the ground. Jake could smell the thing's breath, like rotting meat mixed with acid. Its mandibles snapped inches from his face as he struggled to bring his rifle to bear. The creature was heavier than it looked, and its remaining claws were trying to find gaps in his protective suit. Lyra's voice rang out across the chamber in what sounded like a war cry. Jake heard the splash of water and looked up to see her running across the shallow pools toward them. She was limping badly but moving with determination that reminded him of soldiers he had served with. Jake managed to get his knees up between himself and the creature, using his legs to push against its weight. The thing was strong, but Jake had trained in higher gravity than this world provided. He had advantages the creature didn't expect. With a grunt of effort, Jake shoved the monster backward and fired his rifle into its exposed underside. The plasma bolt burned through softer tissue, and the creature's roar became a scream of pain. It stumbled away from him, blue-green fluid pouring from the wound, but there were still more of them. Jake counted at least 8 creatures still active in the chamber, and he could hear more approaching through the tunnels. His ammunition wouldn't last much longer, and the survivors were still trapped on their island. Lyra reached his position and helped him to his feet. She was breathing hard from the effort of crossing the chamber, but her eyes were bright with fierce determination. She pointed toward the island and spoke rapidly, making gestures that Jake interpreted as a plan. She wanted to create a diversion while he made his way to the survivors. It was dangerous, maybe suicidal, but it might be their only chance. Jake looked at this brave alien girl who was willing to risk her life for her people, and he made his choice. He nodded and handed her one of his remaining flashbang grenades. She examined it carefully, then looked back at him with understanding. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. The creatures were regrouping for another assault. Jake could see them moving through the shadows, their eyes reflecting the pool light like stars. The pack leader was wounded but still dangerous, and it was calling to the others with clicking sounds that echoed through the chamber. Jake checked his rifle one more time. 12 shots left, plus 1 spare power cell. It would have to be enough to reach those survivors and get them all out of this nightmare alive. Lyra pulled the pin from the flashbang grenade and hurled it toward the far side of the chamber. The explosion lit up the cave like lightning, and she immediately began running in the opposite direction, shouting in her musical language to draw the creature's attention away from Jake. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. He sprinted toward the island where the survivors waited, firing his rifle at any creature that moved to intercept him. The phosphorescent pools splashed around his boots as he ran through the shallow water, the glowing liquid creating trails of light behind him. The first survivor he reached was the child, a small being who looked even younger than Lyra. The little one was crying softly, speaking in the same musical language but with a higher pitch that reminded Jake of frightened birdsong. Jake scooped the child up in his free arm while continuing to fire at the approaching creatures. The elderly survivor spoke to Jake in broken English, words mixed with their own language. "Help us, please help us," the old one said, reaching out with trembling hands. "The hunters came from the dark between stars. They follow us everywhere." Jake realized this elderly being had learned some human language, probably from intercepted communications or previous contact. That would make coordination easier if they could get out of here alive. 2 more survivors were adults, both wounded, but able to move. One had a deep gash across their chest where creature claws had found their mark. The other was holding their arm at an odd angle, probably broken. The remaining two were teenagers, older than Lyra but younger than the adults. Jake's rifle spoke again and again as creatures tried to surround the island. The pack leader was organizing them into a coordinated assault, using the chamber's geography to trap the humans and aliens in the center. Smart predators, Jake thought grimly. Too smart for comfort, Lyra was still creating chaos on the far side of the chamber, using her crystal weapon and quick movements to stay ahead of the creatures chasing her. But Jake could see she was tiring. Her injured ankle was slowing her down, and more creatures were emerging from the tunnels to join the hunt. The elderly survivor grabbed Jake's arm and pointed toward one of the tunnel entrances. "Ship pieces," they said in their accented English. "Tools, weapons, maybe still working?" Jake understood. Parts of their crashed vessel might contain technology they could use. Jake made a quick decision. He couldn't carry all the survivors and fight at the same time, but he couldn't leave them defenseless either. He pulled his combat knife from its sheath and handed it to one of the adult survivors, showing them how to hold it properly. The wounded adult understood immediately and took the knife with steady hands. Jake could see determination in their large eyes, the same fierce spirit that Lyra had shown. These people were not going to give up without a fight. Jake fired his last shot from the current power cell and quickly replaced it with his spare. 8 shots left total, and at least 6 creatures still moving in the chamber. The math was not encouraging, but Jake had been in worse situations during the border wars. The pack leader charged across the chamber toward the island, its massive bulk creating waves in the phosphorescent pools. Jake aimed carefully and fired, the plasma bolt striking the creature's head plating. The shot cracked the armor but didn't penetrate, only serving to enrage the monster further. That's when Jake noticed something important. The creature's armor was thicker on top but thinner on the sides where the plates joined together. Weak points, just like any other predator. He filed that information away for later use. Lyra's voice called out from across the chamber, and Jake looked up to see her pointing at the ceiling above the pack leader. A cluster of stalactites hung there, sharp as spears and heavy as anvils. If he could bring them down at the right moment, it might give them the advantage they needed. Jake aimed at the rock formations above the pack leader and fired. The superheated plasma bolt cracked the stone, but the stalactites held firm. He fired again, using precious ammunition to weaken the ceiling structure. Cracks spread across the rock like spider webs. The pack leader reached the edge of the island, just as Jake fired his third shot at the ceiling. This time the stalactites broke free, crashing down in a shower of razor-sharp stone. The massive creature tried to dodge, but its own size worked against it. The largest stalactite struck the pack leader between the shoulder plates, driving deep into the softer tissue beneath its armor. Blue-green fluid spurted from the wound, as the creature let out a roar that shook the entire chamber. It stumbled backward, wounded but not dead. The other creatures hesitated for a moment, confused by their leader's injury. Jake used that moment to grab the elderly survivor and one of the teenagers, helping them toward the tunnel entrance that led to the crashed ship parts. Lyra understood his plan immediately and began moving in the same direction, still fighting off the smaller creatures that pursued her. The combat knife Jake had given to the wounded adult survivor flashed in the phosphorescent light as they defended the group's retreat. The tunnel was narrow and dark, lit only by scattered patches of the glowing fungi. Jake could hear the creatures following behind them, their clicking and chittering echoing off the stone walls. But the confined space worked in the humans' favor now. The creatures couldn't surround them or use their numbers effectively. Jake's rifle fired twice more as they moved through the tunnel, dropping creatures that got too close. 5 shots remaining, and they still had to find the ship wreckage and get everyone back to the surface. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber filled with debris from the alien ship. Twisted metal and strange crystalline components lay scattered across the floor, some still glowing with internal energy. The elderly survivor immediately began searching through the wreckage, looking for anything that might help. They found it near the back of the chamber. A weapon of some kind, sleek and organic looking compared to Jake's plasma rifle. The elderly Survivor activated it with touches that seemed more like caresses, and the device hummed to life with a sound like singing wind. Lyra spoke rapidly to the elderly survivor, gesturing toward the tunnel entrance where clicking sounds were growing. Louder. The old one nodded and said something back, then turned to Jake with the alien weapon in their hands. "This will help," they said in their careful English. "But we must reach the surface before the great hunter heals. It will not stay wounded." "For long," Jake nodded, understanding that the pack leader was probably already recovering from its injuries. These creatures were tougher than anything he had faced before, and they were running out of time. The clicking sounds reached the chamber entrance just as the group prepared to make their final push for freedom. Jake checked his rifle one more time and looked at the brave aliens who were depending on him to get them home. Whatever happened next, he would not let them down. The creatures poured into the chamber like a dark tide, their eyes gleaming in the scattered light from the ship wreckage. Jake counted at least 8 of them, including several he thought he had killed earlier. These things were harder to stop. Then he had realized the elderly survivor raised the alien weapon, and it sang with a sound like crystal wind chimes. A beam of pure white energy lanced out, striking the lead creature center mass. Unlike Jake's plasma rifle, this weapon seemed to disrupt the creatures at a molecular level. The monster simply dissolved into glowing particles that faded into nothing. Jake whistled softly in appreciation. Now that was a weapon worth having. But even with alien technology on their side, they were still outnumbered and trapped in a dead end chamber. Lyra limped over to another piece of wreckage and pulled out what looked like a small metal sphere. She spoke quickly to the elderly survivor, who nodded and replied in their musical language. Jake didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. They were planning something desperate. The wounded adult survivor was helping the teenagers gather more debris, building a rough barricade near the chamber entrance. Jake realized they were preparing for a siege, trying to buy time for whatever plan Lyra and the elder had in mind. More creatures appeared in the tunnel entrance, but they seemed hesitant to enter the chamber. Jake wondered if they were afraid of the alien weapon or if they were waiting for something else. His question was answered when a new sound echoed through the cave's heavy footsteps, accompanied by a grinding noise like metal on stone. The pack leader was coming, and it was dragging something behind it, probably parts of the broken stalactites, Jake realized. The creature was using tools. Jake fired at the smaller creatures near the entrance, his plasma bolt taking down one that had ventured too close to their barricade. 4 shots left in his rifle, and then he would be down to his combat knife and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The pack leader appeared in the tunnel entrance, and Jake saw what it was, dragging not just stone fragments, but pieces of metal from somewhere else in the cave system. The creature had armor plating bolted to its wounded areas, crude but effective protection against their weapons. Lyra held up the metal sphere and spoke to Jake in careful English words she had learned by listening to him. "This makes big noise. Breaks stone, you understand?" Jake nodded. "Some kind of explosive device, probably from their ship's emergency supplies." The elderly survivor continued firing the energy weapon, each shot dissolving another creature into glowing particles. But Jake could see the weapon was losing power with each use. The crystalline components were growing dimmer, and the singing sound was becoming fainter. The pack leader entered the chamber with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. It was even larger than Jake had thought, nearly filling the tunnel entrance with its bulk. The improvised armor made it look like some kind of mechanical nightmare, all claws and plates and burning eyes. Jake aimed at the creature's legs where the armor was thinner, but his plasma bolt barely scorched the metal plating. The pack leader had learned from their earlier encounters and protected its weak points. Intelligence and adaptation, Jake thought grimly. These creatures were evolving their tactics in real time. Lyra activated the explosive sphere, and Jake could hear it beginning to charge with a high-pitched whine. She pointed toward the ceiling above the pack leader and made throwing motions. Jake understood immediately. Bring down the roof and bury the creatures, even if it meant trapping themselves in the process. The wounded adult survivor grabbed Jake's arm and pointed toward a narrow crack in the chamber's back wall. Jake had missed it earlier, but there, was definitely an opening there. Too small for the creatures to follow, but possibly large enough for the survivors to escape through. Jake made his decision. He grabbed one of the teenagers and pushed them toward the crack in the wall, then gestured for the others to follow. The elderly survivor understood and began herding the group toward their escape route while continuing to fire at the advancing creatures. The pack leader charged across the chamber, its armored bulk crushing debris underfoot. Jake fired his remaining shots at the creature's face, hoping to blind it or at least slow it down. The plasma bolts struck the armor around its head but failed to penetrate. Lyra pulled the trigger mechanism on the explosive sphere and hurled it toward the ceiling above the pack leader. The device arced through the air, its whine growing louder and more urgent. Jake grabbed Lyra around the waist and dove toward the wall crack just as the sphere detonated. The explosion was tremendous, far more powerful than Jake's flashbang grenades. The entire chamber shook as tons of rock crashed down from the ceiling. The pack leader's roar was cut short as massive stones buried it beneath an avalanche of debris. Jake and Lyra tumbled through the crack in the wall just as the chamber began to collapse completely. Behind them, the sounds of crushing stone and creature screams echoed through the cave system. Jake hoped the other survivors had made it. Through ahead of them, the crack opened into a natural chimney that led upward toward the surface. Jake could see stars through an opening far above, and he had never been so happy to see the night sky in his life. The climb would be difficult, especially with Lyra's injured ankle, but it was their way out. One by one, the survivors emerged from the crack and began climbing toward freedom. The elderly survivor went first, using handholds carved into the rock by countless years of water erosion. The teenagers followed, then the wounded adults, each helping the others reach the next ledge. Jake went last, carrying the small child while helping Lyra climb with her makeshift splint. The ascent took nearly an hour, but eventually they all stood on the surface under the twin moons of this alien world. Jake's rover was still parked near the canyon entrance where he had left it hours earlier. The vehicle's communication system immediately began receiving emergency signals as soon as Jake activated it. The mining facility had been tracking his movements and was preparing a rescue team. As they drove back toward the facility, Lyra sat beside Jake and spoke in careful English. "You saved us when you could have walked away. Why did you help strangers?" Jake thought about that question as the facility's lights appeared on the horizon. Why had he risked everything for people he had never met? The answer came to him as he looked at the alien refugees in his rover, wounded but alive. "Because it was the right thing to do," Jake said simply. "Where I come from, we don't leave people behind when they need help. Doesn't matter if they're human or not." Lyra smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he had seen her look truly happy since finding her in that web. "Then your people and my people will be good friends," she said. Jake nodded, watching the stars wheel overhead as they drove toward safety. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple rescue mission. Something that would change both their peoples forever.